Some domestic nightmares are so profoundly unnatural that they permanently shatter the collective psyche of an entire nation. In the early autumn of 2000, Australian police entered a routine suburban bungalow to find a slaughterhouse worker had transformed her partner's body into a meticulously prepared dinner intended for his own adult children. This was not a random act of insanity. It was a cold, calculated ritual of ultimate domestic vengeance. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. To understand the trajectory of Australia's most horrific domestic crime, the narrative must pull back from that blood-soaked dining room table on St. Andrews Street and look deeply into the flat, dust-choked landscape of the Hunter Valley. Long before her name became synonymous with an unprecedented level of calculated brutality, Katherine Mary Knight was shaped by a generational cycle of severe dysfunction and systemic isolation. Born on October 24, 1955, in the small, insular town of Tenterfield, New South Wales, her entry into the world was already complicated by social scandal and rigid domestic pressure. Her family dynamics were marked by extreme instability from the very beginning. Her mother, a woman who had abandoned her previous marriage and 4 children to escape severe domestic hardship, entered into a highly volatile relationship with Katherine's biological father, a man known across the local logging camps for his aggressive temperament and dependency on alcohol. The household was a claustrophobic environment where verbal threats and physical confrontations served as the primary language of problem solving. In this rural, working-class setting, conflict was not navigated through mediation. It was settled with fists and heavy, blunt instruments. Growing up alongside her twin sister and 2 older brothers, Katherine was exposed daily to the raw realities of survival in an environment entirely devoid of emotional security or structural boundaries. Neighbors from that era recalled a home where screaming matches routinely pierced the heavy valley air, and local authorities were frequently called to intervene in domestic disputes that left physical markers on both parents. As she entered adolescence, Katherine began to mirror the erratic, domineering traits of her father. She struggled significantly within the rigid structure of the local school system, showing a profound lack of interest in academic pursuits and a growing tendency toward physical intimidation. Classmates noted her intimidating physical presence and her absolute refusal to back down from any confrontation, often escalating minor schoolyard disagreements into explosive acts of aggression. By the age of 15, she permanently abandoned her formal education, seeking a landscape where her lack of academic discipline would not hinder her survival. That landscape was the local abattoir in Aberdeen, a massive industrialized slaughterhouse that served as the economic lifeblood of the entire district. It was within the high-throughput processing lines of the meatworks that Katherine truly found her calling, entering a hyper-masculine, desensitized world where death was a metric of daily production. While many workers viewed the slaughterhouse as a grueling, soul-crushing necessity to secure a paycheck, she openly thrived in the heavy, metallic stench of the killing floors. She became the first woman in the region to be granted registration as a specialized slaughterhouse worker, mastering the precise art of the skinning knives, the heavy cleavers, and the industrial bone saws. Her professional execution was terrifyingly flawless. Day after day, she stood on the concrete slates, drenched in wash water and animal residue, disassembling massive carcasses with a cold, rhythmic efficiency that deeply unnerved even her male counterparts. Co-workers frequently observed her absolute fascination with the tools of her trade. She did not leave her work at the factory gates. Instead, she began curating a personal collection of professional-grade skinning blades at home, maintaining their edges with a diamond steel sharpener until they could slice through heavy leather with a single, effortless pull. The abattoir did not create her inner darkness. It merely provided her with the perfect, clinically precise toolkit to manifest it. The volatility that defined Katherine Knight's early years didn't dissipate as she entered adulthood. It intensified, morphing into a calculated pattern of domestic terrorism that left a trail of physically and psychologically shattered men across the Hunter Valley. To understand how John Price eventually became her final victim, one must look at the terrifying blueprint established by her earlier relationships. For Katherine, domestic life was not a partnership. It was a high-stakes arena of absolute dominance, enforced through the clinical precision of her butchery tools. Her first major relationship began in the mid-1970s when she married a fellow abattoir worker named David Kelton. Almost immediately, the marriage degenerated into a claustrophobic nightmare of severe possessiveness. Katherine's control was absolute, and any perceived infraction by her husband was met with immediate, disproportionate violence. During one early dispute, she picked up a heavy frying pan and struck him across the head with enough force to shatter the handle. On another occasion, while he lay sleeping, she took a professional skinning knife from her collection and pressed the cold edge against his throat, quietly informing him that she could slice his jugular before he even had the chance to wake up. The marriage produced children, but the domestic environment remained a war zone. When the relationship finally fractured and Kelton attempted to leave, Katherine took their 2-month-old infant and placed the baby in a carriage on the local railway tracks, waiting by the side of the line for a train to approach before a horrified passerby intervened. Following the collapse of her first marriage, her behavioral patterns grew even more calculated. In the late 1980s, she focused her attention on a local miner named David Saunders. The dynamic followed the exact same trajectory. Initial intense affection rapidly giving way to severe psychological control and extreme physical outbursts. Saunders quickly learned that his wife's anger was not something that could be reasoned with. When he tried to socialize with friends outside her direct supervision, she reacted by slitting the throat of his favorite dingo pup right in front of him, using a single, clean stroke that mirrored her daily work on the killing floors. The message was clear. Anyone or anything that defied her absolute authority was subject to the rules of the slaughterhouse. The relationship ended abruptly after Katherine took a high-caliber heavy iron skillet during an argument and fractured Saunders' jaw, leaving him permanently scarred and deeply traumatized. By the time John Price crossed her path in the mid-1990s, Katherine Knight was widely known throughout the small community of Aberdeen as an incredibly dangerous, unstable force. Yet, Price, a well-liked, hard-working father of 3 who lived in a neat weatherboard home on St. Andrew's Street, initially saw only a fiercely independent, capable woman who could manage a household with immense efficiency. Price was a regional manager at a local business, respected by his peers, and deeply dedicated to his children. He was a gentleman, entirely unequipped for the level of pathological manipulation that was about to enter his life. The early months of their relationship presented a carefully constructed facade of domestic normalcy. Katherine moved into his home and took over the daily routines, cleaning the property and preparing meals with the same rigorous, almost military discipline she applied to her shift work. But beneath this structured surface, the machinery of control was already grinding into motion. The shift began with subtle financial manipulation. She insisted on managing his bank accounts, tracking every single dollar he spent, and systematically isolating him from his lifelong friends. The psychological erosion quickly escalated into overt physical intimidation. Price's adult children noticed a chilling shift in the household atmosphere. Their father, once an outgoing and confident man, began to walk on eggshells, constantly monitoring Katherine's mood to prevent an explosion. The domestic space became cluttered with her extensive collection of abattoir knives, which she kept meticulously sharpened and positioned in visible areas throughout the kitchen and hallway. The first major rupture occurred when Price attempted to assert his independence regarding a financial matter. Katherine responded by going to his bedroom, retrieving a hidden box containing his personal documents, and setting them on fire in the backyard. When he tried to extinguish the flames, she walked into the kitchen, picked up a heavy carving blade, and slashed it across his chest, leaving a deep gash that required immediate medical attention. Despite the bleeding, Price refused to report the incident to the police, hiding the wound beneath his work shirts out of a profound sense of shame and fear. By late 1999, the relationship had completely deteriorated into a cycle of eviction and forced reconciliation. Price would build up the courage to throw her out of the house, only for Katherine to return weeks later, using intense emotional manipulation and explicit threats to force her way back through the front door. She began telling neighbors that Price would never leave her alive, making the statement with a flat, emotionless delivery that deeply unsettled those who heard it. Price himself began to realize the gravity of his situation. He confided in his coworkers that he was terrified of going to sleep at night, constantly checking the locks on the doors and windows, because he knew that the woman sharing his bed possessed both the tools and the clinical knowledge to dismantle a human body without hesitating for a single second. The stage was completely set for a disaster that the tight-knit Valley community could never have anticipated. The tension within the weatherboard house on St. Andrews Street reached its absolute limit on the final Tuesday of February 2000. John Price had spent the entire day at his workplace, visibly exhausted and deeply preoccupied with his immediate safety. He had taken the formal step of visiting the local courthouse earlier that week to secure a restraining order, fully recognizing that his domestic situation was no longer sustainable. He confided in his supervisor that he intended to finalize his separation from Katherine Knight that very evening, explicitly requesting that if he failed to arrive for his scheduled shift the following morning, authorities should be dispatched to his residence immediately. His actions were those of a man who understood he was living alongside an active threat. Yet he returned to the property one last time to collect his belongings and secure his home. When he arrived back at the house, the atmosphere was deceptively quiet. The children were away, staying at a safe distance due to the volatile environment. Katherine was present, waiting in the shadows of the domestic space she had systematically controlled for years. There was no explosive argument upon his entry. Instead, a calculated silence hung over the rooms. Price, physically drained from the relentless psychological warfare of the preceding months, retired to the master bedroom early in the evening. He consumed a mild sleep aid to combat his chronic insomnia, turned off the bedside lamp, and fell into a deep, drug-induced sleep. He believed the heavy deadbolts on the doors would protect him for the night, completely unaware that the true danger was already inside, moving silently through the dark hallway. It was shortly after midnight when the absolute stillness of the house fractured. Katherine stood over the sleeping man, holding a heavy-duty, 12-inch abattoir skinning knife from her personal collection. The blade had been honed to a razor edge using her diamond steel sharpener earlier that evening. Without a single word or warning, she brought the weapon down into his chest with massive, rhythmic force. The first puncture wound pierced his lung, instantly flooding his respiratory tract with fluid and cutting off his ability to scream. Price woke up into a chaotic, suffocating nightmare, his body paralyzed by sleep medication and sudden, excruciating trauma. He instinctively rolled off the mattress, hitting the floorboard with a heavy thud, and attempted to crawl toward the doorway. The physical struggle that followed was exceptionally brutal, leaving a permanent forensic record across the entire layout of the house. Price was fighting for his life in absolute darkness, slipping on his own blood as he desperately tried to reach the front exit. Katherine pursued him with absolute, clinical focus, entirely unhindered by his frantic attempts to ward off the blows. She struck him repeatedly from behind, targeting his neck, his shoulders, and his torso with the exact same motion she used on the processing lines at the Aberdeen meatworks. Blood spatters coated the floral wallpaper of the hallway, forming a trail that documented his slow, agonizing progress toward the light switch. Price managed to raise a hand to the wall, leaving a distinct smeared palm print before Katherine severed the tendons in his wrist with a precise, clean slash. He collapsed near the front door, his internal organs failing from a total of 37 deep stab wounds. The final blow penetrated his heart, bringing an immediate, chilling silence to the hallway. Price lay face down on the blood-soaked carpet. His struggle ended just steps away from the safety of the street outside. What occurred over the next 7 hours shifted the case from a standard domestic homicide into a realm of unprecedented, historical depravity. Katherine did not flee the scene, nor did she panic. Instead, the familiar environment of the slaughterhouse completely overrode her domestic reality. She transitioned seamlessly into her professional persona as a master butcher, treating her partner's remains as a standard carcass on the killing floor. She dragged the heavy body back into the hallway, positioning it beneath a sturdy doorframe. Using a specialized butcher's hook and high-tensile nylon cord, She hoisted the torso upward to allow the blood to drain efficiently onto the floorboards, a standard abattoir procedure designed to preserve meat quality. She then retrieved her full kit of industrial tools, 3 specialized skinning blades, a heavy bone saw, and a sharpening steel. With terrifyingly clinical precision, Katherine began the process of flaying the body. She made a single, continuous incision from the throat down to the groin, followed by clean circular cuts around the wrists and ankles. Her years of processing cattle allowed her to remove the entire human skin in one intact piece, completely preserving the facial features and hair. She rolled the flayed skin carefully and hung it from a prominent meat hook attached to the wooden lintel of the living room doorway, creating a gruesome curtain that brushed against anyone walking through the house. Once the flaying was complete, she utilized the industrial bone saws to decapitate the body, severing the head with a clean cut between the 3rd and 4th cervical vertebrae. She carried the head into the kitchen, placing it into a massive stainless steel boiling pot positioned on the stovetop. She filled the vessel with water, turned the gas burner to high, and added a precise selection of root vegetables, potatoes, pumpkins, and carrots, along with a measured handful of dried herbs and salt. Her intention was to create a traditional, slow-cooked meat stew. While the pot began to simmer, emitting a heavy, sweetish vapor that filled the small kitchen, Katherine returned to the hallway to harvest the prime cuts of meat from the torso. Using her finest boning knife, she sliced large parallel slabs of muscle tissue from Price's buttocks and thighs. She carried these portions to the kitchen counter, where she prepared them with meticulous domestic care. She arranged 2 matching ceramic dinner plates on the dining room table, using her finest linen placements. On each plate, she placed a substantial serving of the baked human meat, garnishing the portions with charred vegetables from the oven. Next to each setting, she positioned a handwritten note containing the first names of Price's adult children. She had constructed a formal family dinner, intended to be discovered by his children when they arrived to look for their father the following morning. The physical exertion of the butchery took several hours, requiring her to repeatedly sharpen her blades against the steel. The sound of metal scraping metal echoed through the empty house until the early hours of dawn. When the preparations were completely finalized, Katherine walked to the master bathroom, washed the animal and human residue from her arms and face, and consumed a massive dose of prescription sedatives. She walked back to the blood-stained master bedroom, climbed onto the unmade bed, and fell into a profound, unresponsive sleep, leaving the stove burner operating at full capacity beneath the boiling pot. The transition from a quiet rural night to the blinding clarity of a summer morning in the Hunter Valley usually brought the steady rhythm of shifting gears and industrial exhaust. But on March 1st, 2000, the property at St. Andrews Street resisted the morning light, remaining completely silent behind drawn, heavy curtains. The first indication that the domestic structure had completely detached from its neighborhood routine came at precisely 7:40 a.m., when a local co-worker arrived at the front gate. John Price was a man governed by absolute operational consistency. His entire professional reputation was built on arriving at his managerial station at least 20 minutes before the opening whistles blew. When his vehicle failed to appear in the staff parking lot, a collective unease immediately rippled through the administrative offices. His supervisor, recalling the specific flat warning Price had delivered less than 24 hours earlier, did not hesitate. He dispatched a senior logistics handler to the residence to physically verify his well-being. The handler parked his utility truck along the dusty curb, noting that Price's standard work vehicle was still positioned in the driveway, its metal hood completely cold to the touch. The property appeared frozen. There were no signs of morning movement, no rustle of domestic activity, and the family dog was completely absent from its usual post on the veranda. Walking up the concrete steps, the worker knocked heavily on the wooden frame of the front door, the sound echoing hollowly through the small house. There was no response, only the faint, rhythmic hiss of a high-pressure gas line operating somewhere in the rear of the structure. Peer through the side windowsill, the handler noticed a peculiar, dense condensation coating the interior glass pane of the kitchen, accompanied by a heavy, chemical sweetness that seemed to cut through the scent of the surrounding eucalyptus trees. Recognizing that the situation matched the exact parameters of the warning Price had left at the office, the worker backed down the stairs, retrieved his mobile device, and placed an urgent call directly to the Muswellbrook police station. The initial response from local law enforcement was categorized as a routine welfare check, a standard, low-priority dispatch to resolve a potential domestic standoff or a medical emergency. 2 junior patrol officers were assigned to the call, navigating the winding valley roads with their lights completely dark, operating under the assumption that they were dealing with a minor neighborhood dispute. They arrived at the scene at approximately 8:15 a.m., their boots crunching loudly on the dry gravel path as they approached the front entryway. The heavy sense of isolation immediately forced the officers into a state of heightened caution. They noted that while the front door was completely unlocked, the heavy brass deadbolt had been left pulled out, preventing the latch from fully seating within the iron frame. One officer extended a gloved hand, slowly pushing the door inward. The wood groaned slightly on its hinges, opening into a dim, narrow hallway that completely defied the standard layout of a residential home. The interior air was thick, humid, and held at an unnatural temperature, driven by the continuous operation of the stove burners in the adjacent room. The sensory impact was immediate, a heavy, copper-heavy smell of raw blood, combined with the overpowering aroma of cooked onions and root vegetables. The officers stopped completely on the threshold, their eyes adjusting to the deep shadows of the corridor. The floor beneath them was completely obscured. A dense, dark fluid had saturated the gray synthetic carpet, creating a reflective surface that pools around the baseboard. Smeared along the floral wallpaper were long, vertical streaks of dark red, ending in a distinct, trembling palm print located near the main light switch. The marks provided an immediate, undeniable narrative of a violent struggle that had moved from the interior rooms toward the exit. The officers drew their standard-issue service weapons, their movements slowing to a clinical crawl as they stepped into the liquid, their boots making a heavy, sticking sound with every forward progression. As they reached the junction where the hallway opened into the main living pavilion, their flashlights cut through the gloom, illuminating an object suspended directly from the center of the wooden door lintel. It appeared to be a heavy, pale fabric swaying gently in the thermal currents created by the open door. It took several seconds for the lead officer's brain to process the geometry of the object. It was not a curtain or a garment. It was an entire human skin, hung neatly from an industrial meat hook, its edges trimmed with the absolute precision of a commercial butcher. The face of John Price hung at eye level, completely intact, the empty eye sockets staring blankly toward the front door, while the rest of the flayed tissue draped down to within inches of the blood-soaked floorboards. The second officer completely lost his professional composure, retreating toward the open veranda to escape the claustrophobic stench of the interior. The lead investigator, operating under a state of psychological shock, forced himself to move past the flayed tissue and enter the kitchen pavilion. There, the domestic order of the household had been completely synthesized with the operational routine of an abattoir. On the kitchen counter sat 2 prepared plates, the meat arranged alongside roasted vegetables with a terrifying level of care. Next to each plate, a handwritten label identified Price's adult children as the intended consumers of the meal. On the stove, the massive stainless steel pot continued to boil, its lid rattling against the metal rim as steam carried bits of human tissue into the air. The officer turned his weapon toward the dark doorway of the master bedroom, expecting to encounter an armed suspect waiting in the darkness. Instead, he found Katherine Knight lying completely motionless beneath a stained sheet, her breathing slow and heavy, completely unresponsive to the commands echoing through the house. She had entered a deep, drug-induced coma, her body entirely relaxed in the immediate aftermath of her ritualistic violence. Within 20 minutes, the property was completely cordoned off with heavy blue forensic tape, transforming the quiet suburban street into a centralized crime scene that would fundamentally alter the cultural landscape of the entire valley. The entry of the State Crime Command Forensic Squad into the property at St. Andrews Street marked the beginning of an investigative process that quickly dissolved into deep professional frustration. In standard homicide cases, detectives are forced to hunt for hidden clues, microscopic fibers, or vanished suspects. Here, the challenge was entirely reversed. The evidence was massive, overwhelming, and presented with a terrifying lack of concealment. Yet, the initial phase of the investigation ran directly into a series of procedural dead ends and legal complexities that threatened to stall the prosecution before a formal indictment could even be drafted. The specialized team of pathologists and criminal analysts had to systematically document a crime scene that defied every established forensic protocol in the state's history. The first major hurdle for the detectives was establishing the precise chronological sequence of the physical trauma, a task made exceptionally difficult by the state of the remains. Initial field theories suggested that Katherine Knight must have operated with at least one accomplice, as the sheer physical exertion required to hoist, flay, and dismember a full-grown adult male seemed beyond the capacity of a single individual working under a strict time constraint. Investigators launched a massive secondary line of inquiry, targeting local abattoir workers and scanning Knight's recent communications for any indication of a conspiracy. They spent days analyzing neighborhood surveillance feeds and interviewing local transit workers, pursuing a prominent theory that a second slaughterhouse technician had assisted in the clean removal of the skin. This line of investigation proved to be an extensive red herring. Ballistic and physical stress models eventually demonstrated that Knight's industrial training and immense physical strength, honed by decades of lifting cattle carcasses, allowed her to complete the entire process alone, utilizing basic mechanical leverage and her specialized toolkit. The secondary dead end emerged during the evaluation of the digital and medical evidence. Crime scene analysts discovered several prescription bottles belonging to Knight scattered across the kitchen counter, suggesting that she might have acted under a state of profound, involuntary intoxication or a sudden, catastrophic psychological break that would render her legally unfit to stand trial. Detectives spent weeks dissecting her medical history, interviewing regional psychiatrists, and reviewing clinic records from across New South Wales. The defense initially leaned heavily on this narrative, presenting Knight as a victim of a sudden, unpreventable psychotic episode, but the forensic pathology report directly dismantled this claim. The sheer precision of the skinning process, specifically the clean preservation of the dermal layers around the hands and neck, required an exceptional level of fine motor control and cognitive clarity. A person operating under a severe, disorienting psychotic event could not have executed cuts that matched the exact standards of a commercial meat processing facility. The investigation proved that she was entirely aware of her actions, moving from one task to the next with absolute, cold-blooded deliberation. As the technical details of the forensic report began to leak into the surrounding community, the social fabric of the Hunter Valley experienced a profound and immediate shock. Aberdeen was a town where generations of families worked side by side on the processing lines. Violence was understood in the context of the meatworks, but the synthesis of that violence with a suburban home completely shattered the local sense of security. Rumors spread rapidly through the local pubs and retail storefronts, with many residents refusing to leave their homes after dark. The neat weatherboard house on St. Andrews Street became an object of collective horror, a physical monument to a pathology that lived right next door. Local workers who had spent years sharing shifts with Knight expressed a deep retrospective terror, realizing that the cold, rhythmic efficiency they had admired on the killing floors was the exact same methodology she used to systematically dismantle her domestic partner. The psychological profile compiled by state analysts during her detention revealed a mindset entirely governed by an extreme need for punitive dominance. Knight's behavior in the weeks preceding the crime was not driven by fear or self-defense. It was a slow, deliberate preparation for an act of total ownership. When Price attempted to legalize his separation from her, he was not merely ending a relationship. He was challenging her absolute control over his existence. In her internal logic, the rules of the abattoir were the only rules that mattered. If a piece of property resisted her authority, it was to be broken down, processed, and consumed. The notes she left next to the dinner plates were the ultimate expression of this mindset, a final, permanent message to Price's lineage that her dominance extended beyond his death. The investigation successfully shifted from a chaotic search for answers into a tightly constructed, unassailable legal case, completely isolating Knight within her own pathologically documented reality. The legal culmination of the state's case against Katherine Knight began in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, where the prosecution presented an unyielding wall of forensic evidence that left no room for programmatic defense maneuvers. Recognizing the absolute futility of contesting the physical reality documented on St. Andrew's Street, Knight entered a formal plea of guilty to the indictment of murder. This tactical decision bypassed a lengthy jury trial, but thrust the proceeding directly into a highly charged sentencing phase, where the judicial system was forced to calibrate a penalty for a level of domestic depravity never before codified in Australian legal history. Justice Barry O'Keefe presided over the hearing, systematically reviewing the clinical pathology records, the evidence of intense premeditation, and the psychological evaluation data that proved total cognitive awareness during the execution of the crime. The defense argued desperately for a localized term of years, citing her volatile childhood background and relational trauma. However, the state countered that her actions represented an entirely unique category of nihilistic violence, one that required the absolute permanent removal of the individual from the social contract. On November 8, 2001, Justice O'Keefe handed down a historic determination, sentencing Knight to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This marked the first time in Australian history that a female perpetrator received a true life sentence. Her papers permanently marked to ensure she would never again cross the threshold of a correctional facility. The justice explicitly noted that the extreme mutilation and the ritualistic preparation of the remains placed the offense beyond the boundaries of standard human conduct, rendering any future rehabilitation entirely irrelevant to the preservation of public safety. The weatherboard house on St. Andrew's Street was eventually demolished, removing the physical frame of the crime from the Aberdeen landscape. Yet the structural trauma within the Hunter Valley cannot be cleared so easily. The community remains quietly haunted by the realization that a modern industrial slaughterhouse worker managed to completely superimpose her professional routine onto the sacred geography of a suburban home. John Price is remembered by his surviving children not as a forensic anomaly or a true crime footnote, but as a deeply dedicated, protective father whose evolutionary mistake was simply misjudging the sheer depth of human depravity sharing his bed. For the remaining residents of the valley, the heavy silence that settles over the hills each evening carries a permanent, gritty reminder. Some domestic structures hide an internal darkness that completely defies the boundaries of legal retribution, leaving behind ghosts that continue to speak through the generational memory of the land. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.